A young mother boards a flight with her baby, hoping for a peaceful journey. But instead of kindness, she faces humiliation, hostility, and even a shocking slap from the very people meant to ensure her comfort and safety. What no one knew was that her husband wasn't just another passenger, he was the unseen power behind the airline itself. The cabin lights glowed softly as the long line of passengers shuffled into the aircraft, dragging their bags and searching for seats. Among them was a young mother carrying her baby in her arms, her shoulders weary but her posture graceful, refusing to show just how tired she truly was. The baby stirred, letting out a small whimper that quickly turned into a louder cry, drawing the attention of those already seated. A few passengers sighed under their breath. Some rolled their eyes, and others simply turned their heads away, unwilling to hide their judgment. The mother adjusted her grip, gently rocking the child, whispering soft words of comfort while navigating the narrow aisle. She finally reached her seat and slid carefully into place, placing her small bag beneath the seat in front of her. Every movement she made carried a sense of quiet determination, as if she had been through this before, as if she knew patience was her only shield. The baby continued to fuss, little fists curling and tiny cries echoing louder in the enclosed space. Instead of compassion, she was met with glances that seemed to cut right through her, as if her very presence was an inconvenience. One man, 2 rows ahead, muttered something about kids these days never being disciplined, while another woman huffed loudly, pressing her fingers against her ears. The mother kept her eyes down, determined not to respond, not to allow the frustration of others to steal the calm she was trying so hard to preserve. She kissed her baby's forehead, brushing away a tear forming in the corner of her eye, and rocked him gently until his cries softened to soft whimpers. As the last passengers found their seats, the flight attendant walked briskly down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She wore a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, her tone cheerful for some passengers and dismissive for others. When her gaze fell on the mother and baby, the faintest flicker of irritation crossed her face. She leaned closer, pretending to check the overhead compartments, but her words slipped out just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Nothing like crying babies to ruin a peaceful flight," she muttered with a forced laugh, glancing at a passenger who smirked in agreement. The mother caught the comment but chose silence. She only tucked her baby closer, whispering, "It's okay, we're okay," as though shielding him not just from noise but from the weight of judgment pressing in from all sides. The safety announcements droned on, and the plane began to taxi toward the runway. The mother reached for the call button and waited patiently as the attendant approached. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, as she asked if she could please have a blanket and some warm water for her child. The attendant tilted her head, narrowed her eyes, and gave a smile that was far from warm. "We'll see if there's time," she replied curtly before walking away without another word. The request had been brushed aside as though it were nothing more than an annoyance, and the mother sat back adjusting the baby in her arms. She bit the inside of her cheek, refusing to let the sting of disrespect show on her face. Moments later, as the plane lifted off, a sudden jolt sent a cup of juice from the tray of a nearby passenger tipping over, splashing onto the floor near her feet. The liquid spread quickly, dampening her bag and leaving a sticky trail beneath the seat. She looked around for help, her voice gentle but strained as she asked if someone could bring tissues. The attendant returned, saw the mess, and with an exaggerated sigh tossed a handful of napkins toward her. "You'll have to clean that yourself," she said, her tone edged with disdain. The mother nodded quietly, reaching down to soak up the spill as best she could while balancing her baby against her shoulder. A few passengers watched but offered no assistance. Their eyes lingered only long enough to judge before they turned back to their screens or books. The baby began to squirm again, his cries rising in pitch. The mother adjusted his blanket, rocking him gently, whispering soothing words that only he could hear. She hummed softly, her voice trembling but tender, trying everything to calm him. Instead of empathy, she was met with audible groans. One passenger pressed the service button, complaining loudly about the noise. Another shook his head and muttered, "Some people just shouldn't fly with babies." Each word pierced deeper, but she didn't respond. She only clutched her child closer, protecting him from the cruelty around them. The attendant passed by again, her expression tight, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at the crying child. "Maybe try keeping him quiet," she snapped under her breath, her tone sharp enough for the mother to hear, but quiet enough to maintain her veneer of professionalism. The mother's lips parted as if she might defend herself, but she stopped. Instead, she lowered her gaze, kissed her baby's forehead, and exhaled a long, steady breath. She knew that any word she spoke would only feed the fire of scorn around her. Silence was her strength, even if it felt unbearably heavy. The minutes dragged on, each second filled with the sound of muffled sobs from the baby and the scraping disapproval of strangers. The mother's heart ached, but she refused to crumble. She rocked her child, wiping his tears, brushing back the soft curls from his forehead. She thought of how many times she had faced this kind of prejudice, how often she had been judged before anyone knew her story. Yet here she was again, enduring in silence, not because she was weak, but because she was stronger than those who tried to break her spirit. By the time the plane leveled into the sky, the baby had finally quieted, his breathing soft and even as he nestled against her chest. She leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes, drawing strength from the rhythm of his tiny heartbeat against hers. Around her, the passengers settled into their routines, flipping through magazines, adjusting headphones, pretending as though nothing had happened. But beneath the hum of the engines, beneath the whispers and the stares, a storm had already begun to brew. A storm that none of them, neither the judgmental passengers nor the cruel attendant, could possibly foresee. For while they looked at her as if she were powerless, none of them knew the truth about the man sitting quietly only a few rows away, watching everything with eyes that missed nothing. And when the storm finally broke, it would change the course of the flight forever. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and constant, yet unable to drown out the restless cry of the baby nestled against his mother's chest. At first it was a whimper, then a louder wail that echoed through the narrow aisle, bouncing off the walls of the aircraft and drawing every pair of eyes toward her. The mother shifted in her seat, rocking her child gently, whispering words of comfort, stroking his back with a tender hand. Her movements were calm, controlled, the patience of someone who had walked this road many times before, but the louder the cries grew, the heavier the stares around her became. People shifted uncomfortably, some covering their ears, some exchanging annoyed glances as if the child's cries were an intentional disturbance instead of the natural outpouring of a baby's need. The flight attendant appeared, her heels striking the floor sharply as she approached. Instead of sympathy, her voice carried the sharp tone of irritation. "Ma'am, you need to control your child," she said loudly enough for the surrounding rows to hear. The words sliced through the air and the baby's cries seemed to grow, even louder under the pressure of that cold command. Passengers turned their heads, some frowning in disapproval, others smirking faintly as though enjoying the unfolding spectacle. The mother's face flushed, her eyes wide with embarrassment, but her voice remained soft, steady, and apologetic. "I'm so sorry. He's just restless. I'll calm him down," she whispered, bouncing the baby gently, trying desperately to soothe him. The attendant did not lower her tone. She stood stiff, arms folded, her lips curled into a disdainful smirk. "You're disturbing everyone here. People paid good money for this flight, and they deserve peace," she declared, her voice projecting down the aisle so more passengers turned to watch. A murmur rippled through the cabin, some nodding in agreement, others looking away uncomfortably, unwilling to be part of the cruelty. The mother felt every stare like a weight pressing down on her chest. She bowed her head slightly, apologizing again, rocking her child with renewed urgency, but the cries did not stop. The passengers' whispers grew bolder now, Why do people even travel with babies? One man scoffed from across the aisle. A young woman shook her head, muttering, "She should have planned better." A chuckle erupted from somewhere in the back, as if the whole situation were entertainment. The mother's throat tightened, but still she refused to raise her voice. "I'm sorry. Please, I'm trying," she said softly, though her words were almost drowned out by her baby's cries. Her eyes glistened, not from shame, but from the pain of being stripped of her dignity so publicly. She gathered her courage, lifted her chin slightly, and asked the attendant in a quiet tone if it was possible to change seats, maybe to a quieter spot where her baby wouldn't disturb so many people. For a moment, there was silence, and then the attendant laughed, a cruel sound that made several passengers raise their brows. A quieter space? On an airplane? Maybe you should have thought about that before dragging a screaming child onto this flight, she mocked, her words sharp and deliberate. A few passengers chuckled under their breath, feeding off her cruelty while others shifted uncomfortably, clearly disturbed by the open ridicule. The mother's lips trembled, but she swallowed her pride, whispering only, "I'm sorry." Once more, she clutched her baby tighter, his cries still piercing the cabin, rocking him desperately as though shielding him from the venom in the air. She turned her face slightly toward the window, hoping to hide the tears welling in her eyes. But the attendant had no intention of letting her escape. She stepped closer, looming over her, her voice louder now, her patience clearly gone. "You're being difficult," she snapped. "All you've done since you boarded is disturb this flight. Do you know how selfish you look right now?" The mother's eyes widened, stunned by the cruelty, but before she could respond, before anyone could intervene, the attendant's hand flew through the air. A sharp crack rang out as her palm struck the mother's face, the sound echoing over the engine's hum. Gasps erupted throughout the cabin, passengers freezing in shock. The mother's head snapped to the side from the blow, but she did not release her child. She tightened her grip, clutching the baby against her chest protectively, shielding him from the violence that had just unfolded. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the frantic cries of the baby, who wailed, louder now, startled by the sudden aggression. Phones appeared in hands instantly, passengers recording, capturing every second of what had just happened. A woman gasped loudly, covering her mouth, while another passenger muttered, "She slapped her. She really slapped her." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from irritation to outrage, disbelief hanging in the air like heavy smoke. The attendant stood rigid, breathing heavily as if she had justified herself, as if her authority gave her the right to strike. She was out of control, she hissed defensively, her eyes darting at the phones raised in the air. I had to do something. She was disturbing everyone. But the faces around her no longer mirrored amusement or agreement. Shock, anger, and disgust replaced the smirks. People whispered fiercely to one another, and a passenger from the back shouted, "That's assault!" The murmur grew louder, a wave of voices clashing, as the weight of what had just happened settled into the hearts of those watching. Through it all, the mother said nothing. Tears streamed down her face, but she did not scream. She did not fight back. She did not let the anger boil over. She only clutched her baby tighter, pressing her cheek against his small head, whispering through her tears, "It's okay. I've got you." Her silence carried more power than any words could, her refusal to retaliate a quiet strength that pierced deeper than any argument. The baby's cries softened slightly, soothed by her heartbeat, though his tiny body still trembled in her arms. She rocked him gently, ignoring the sting on her cheek, ignoring the stares, ignoring the cameras. She refused to let her child feel fear, even if the world around them was filled with cruelty. Her silence became a shield, her dignity a quiet rebellion against the storm she had been forced into. What the flight attendant did not know, what the passengers could not guess, was that someone else had seen everything. Sitting only a few rows away, separated by the curtain of business class, a man had been watching from the very beginning. His face remained calm, his eyes unblinking, his hands folded in his lap as though weighing every detail, every word, every action. He had not moved when the cruel comments were made. He had not spoken when the requests were denied. He had not intervened when the humiliation unfolded. He had sat in silence, waiting, watching. And now, after the slap echoed through the cabin and the mother's quiet tears fell, he knew the time for silence was drawing to an end. For while the passengers saw only a humiliated woman clutching her baby, he saw his family, and nothing in the world could prepare the attendant or anyone else for what would come next. The cabin was no longer calm. The moment the slap had landed, everything changed. The mother sat silently, clutching her baby as though she were shielding him from a storm, her eyes wet with tears that she refused to let spill freely. The sting on her cheek remained, but she didn't reach for it. She didn't raise her voice. She simply rocked her child gently, whispering soft words only he could hear. Around her, however, the atmosphere was restless. Passengers shifted uneasily, whispering to one another in disbelief. Phones were still raised, recording every second, the glow of screens catching the flight attendant's rigid posture as she stood, arms crossed as if daring anyone to challenge her. From the third row, a man spoke sharply. "You went too far. You can't put your hands on a passenger." His voice carried across the aisle, firm and accusing. The attendant's head snapped toward him, her expression incredulous as though she couldn't believe anyone would dare to question her. "She was disturbing the entire cabin," she replied with an icy glare. "I was within my rights. You should all be grateful I didn't have her removed from this flight." Her voice dripped with arrogance, her words echoing loudly enough for everyone to hear. Another passenger, an elderly woman, shook her head and raised her voice. "Grateful? You hit a mother holding her baby. Shame on you." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin, some passengers clapping lightly, others muttering angrily under their breath. But the attendant remained defiant. She adjusted her uniform, lifted her chin, and declared, "I have authority on this plane, and if she can't handle the rules, she shouldn't be here. This is my cabin, and I will not have it disrupted." The tension thickened like smoke. The mother lowered, her eyes unwilling to meet the stares around her as if she were trying to disappear into the seat. Her silence was dignified, but her humiliation hung heavy in the air, pressing on the conscience of those who watched. The baby whimpered softly now, sensing the unease, clinging tighter to her chest. And just as the voices of protest began to rise, another voice cut through the chaos, a voice so calm, so steady that the entire cabin froze in an instant. "Is that so?" The words came from the front of the plane, spoken with quiet authority, yet carrying enough weight to still every murmur. Heads turned. From behind the thin curtain that separated business class from economy, a man stepped forward. His stride was measured, his expression unreadable, but his very presence shifted the atmosphere. It wasn't just that he was tall, or that his tailored suit set him apart. It was something deeper, an aura of command, a force that made every passenger straighten instinctively as though they had just been addressed by someone who demanded respect without asking for it. The flight attendant blinked in surprise, but quickly regained her composure. She held up a hand as if to block his path. "Sir, please return to your seat," she said curtly. "This isn't your concern. We have procedures for dealing with disruptive passengers." Her voice was still, sharp, still carrying the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. But the man did not stop. He continued walking down the aisle with deliberate calm until he stood before the mother and child. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he knelt slightly, lowering himself to look at the baby. His hand hovered gently, brushing the soft hair on the infant's head, then his eyes lifted to meet his wife's. There was no anger in them, only quiet concern, a steady reassurance that spoke volumes without words. She looked back at him, her eyes filling with unspoken relief. Her breath trembled, but she held it together, comforted by the mere sight of him. Only then did he turn his gaze toward the attendant. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and deliberate. "Did you just put your hands on my family?" The question was not shouted, but it struck harder than any yell could have. The entire cabin went silent. Even the baby seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, his whimper fading into stillness. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide, breaths held, waiting for what would come next. The attendant's bravado faltered. She opened her mouth, searching for words, but what came out was weak and unconvincing. She was being difficult, she stammered, her voice lacking the sharp edge it held moments earlier. I had to maintain order. She was disturbing everyone. I didn't have a choice. Her explanation fell flat, the nervous tremor in her tone betraying her fear. The man's expression didn't change. His gaze was steady, piercing, as though he could see straight through the flimsy excuses. Passengers whispered now, but their whispers weren't of judgment toward the mother. They were of curiosity, of recognition that this man wasn't just another traveler. His calm was too controlled, his presence too commanding. They could sense something greater, something hidden beneath the surface. The attendant tried again, her words tumbling clumsily. "Sir, please, I was only doing my job. If she had cooperated, none of this would have happened. You must understand." But he cut her off with a tone colder than ice. "No," he said firmly. "What I understand is that you humiliated a woman in front of an entire cabin. What I understand is that you put your hand on her while she was holding my child." He stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers, his voice unwavering. "And what you clearly don't understand is who you just put your hands on." The attendant froze. Confusion flickered across her face, followed quickly by unease. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The man straightened his shoulders, his gaze sweeping briefly across the passengers before returning to her. His next words fell like a thunderclap. "I own this airline." Gasps erupted from the cabin. A collective shock spread through the passengers, their phones trembling in their hands as they recorded every word. Some leaned forward, whispering fiercely to one another. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. The crew members near the front stiffened instantly, their eyes wide, their bodies frozen as though the air itself had turned to stone. The flight attendant's face drained of color. Her arrogance melted into horror, her defiance collapsing in an instant. She blinked rapidly, shaking her head as though she had misheard him, but the truth pressed down on her like an unbearable weight. Her career, her reputation, her future, everything she had built, suddenly dangled by a single thread, and the man before her held the scissors. Her lips trembled as she whispered, You're the owner?" The man did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence was more damning than any outburst. He simply stood there, his presence filling the cabin with a gravity no one could ignore. The passengers waited breathlessly, their eyes darting between the trembling attendant and the man whose authority had just been revealed. And in that suspended moment, as the weight of his words settled into every corner of the plane, the attendant finally understood the magnitude of her mistake. She hadn't just disrespected a passenger. She had humiliated the wife of the man who controlled her career, her uniform, and her future. And there was no undoing what had been done. The silence after the revelation was suffocating. The hum of the engines the only sound as every passenger sat frozen in shock. The flight attendant stood trembling, her earlier arrogance shattered, her hands shaking as she tried to form words that would not come. Her lips moved, but no sound followed, as though the weight of the truth had stolen her voice. The man remained, still, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on her with a calmness that was far more intimidating than fury could ever be. He did not need to raise his voice, for his very presence commanded attention. Then, in the same measured tone that had silenced the entire cabin moments ago, he spoke. "Call the captain. Now." The attendant's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat, but before she could move, the cabin manager hurried forward. His face was pale, panic written across every feature as he bowed slightly, his words tumbling out in desperate apology. Sir, I had no idea. Please forgive us. Forgive the crew. This should never have happened." His hands twisted nervously, his voice quivering as he tried to regain some measure of control. "The captain will be informed immediately." He turned sharply to the staff, his tone urgent. "Contact the cockpit at once." The passengers watched with rapt attention, their earlier whispers replaced by hushed awe. Many of them had their phones still raised, capturing every moment, but their eyes betrayed something more than curiosity now. Respect, even admiration, for the man who stood so unwaveringly in defense of his family. The mother sat quietly, tears still clinging to her lashes, but her posture had shifted. She no longer looked alone, no longer looked cornered. With her husband beside her, the balance of power in the cabin had shifted completely. The attendant, realizing the depth of her mistake, dropped her earlier mask of superiority. Her knees seemed to weaken as she stumbled slightly, her voice cracking as she tried to plead. "Please, sir, I lost my temper. I didn't mean... It won't happen again. Please don't ruin my career over this." Her words poured out quickly, choked by desperation, but the man did not soften. He looked at her with the same piercing gaze, his voice even, his tone unshakable. "This uniform you wear," he said slowly, his eyes flicking down to her attire, "is not a weapon. It is not a shield to hide cruelty. It represents service, compassion, responsibility, and anyone who forgets that has no place in my company." His words carried the finality of a judge delivering a sentence. No anger, no shouting, just the truth, spoken with a certainty that could not be challenged. A ripple of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. Passengers clapped their hands, some even standing, their voices rising in support of the mother who had been humiliated only moments before. "That's right," someone shouted from the back. "No one should be treated like that." Another voice joined in. "She's a mother. She deserves respect." The sound filled the cabin, a wave of solidarity that wrapped around the woman and her child like a protective embrace. For the first time on the flight, she lifted her eyes, astonished by the sight of strangers standing for her, applauding her dignity after everything she had endured. The attendant broke down completely, her hands covering her face as sobs shook her shoulders. "I'm sorry," she cried, her voice muffled. Please, I was wrong. Give me another chance." But the applause only grew louder, drowning out her pleas, the voices of the passengers rising higher in unison as though delivering their own verdict. The man waited until the sound began to settle, and then he spoke again, his voice carrying effortlessly over the cabin. "When we land," he said firmly, "you will be relieved of duty. Effective immediately." The words struck with the weight of iron. The attendant's sobs grew louder, but there was no pity left in the eyes around her. Her cruelty had been witnessed by too many, her actions immortalized on too many phones. There was no undoing what she had done, no forgiveness that could erase the humiliation she had inflicted on an innocent mother. The cabin manager nodded vigorously, promising compliance. "Yes, sir, of course. She will be removed from service the moment we land." He turned to the rest of the crew, barking quiet orders, his entire demeanor transformed from authority to submission in the presence of the man who owned everything they stood for. And yet, the man himself remained calm, his voice never rising, his composure never slipping. That calmness made him more fearsome than rage could have. He reached down then, slowly, and took his wife's hand in his. The gesture was simple, but it carried a power no words could match. She looked at him, her tears finally breaking free. Not of pain now, but of release, of knowing she was no longer alone in her fight. He raised her hand gently to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles before leaning forward and kissing his baby's forehead. The child stirred faintly, letting out a tiny sigh before drifting into quiet, comforted by the safety of his father's touch. The passengers fell silent, watching the scene with reverence. They had boarded this flight as strangers, but now they were witnesses to something greater than a confrontation. They had seen a woman endure cruelty with grace, and a man reveal that true strength lay not in wealth nor in titles, but in the way he defended his family's dignity without ever needing to shout. As the aircraft soared through the sky, the lesson settled into the hearts of everyone present. Respect costs nothing, yet it can change everything. Dignity is not given by uniforms, nor taken by insults. It is upheld by how one chooses to act, even when the world tests them. When the wheels finally touched the ground and the plane taxied toward the gate, the atmosphere was utterly transformed. Passengers whispered among themselves, their voices filled with admiration and gratitude for what they had witnessed. Some glanced at the mother with small, encouraging smiles, silently offering apologies for the judgment they had carried earlier. Others continued to record, determined to share the story that would ripple far beyond the walls of the cabin. The attendant, slumped in her jump seat, wept silently, her career unraveling before her eyes. The mother, still holding her baby, leaned gently into her husband's shoulder, no longer feeling the sting of humiliation but instead the warmth of protection. And as the applause rose one final time, filling the cabin with a thunderous affirmation, the story found its ending. True power, they all realized, was never in authority misused, nor in wealth flaunted. True power was in restraint, in compassion, in the courage to stand against cruelty and defend the vulnerable. And as the family stepped off the plane, hand in hand, the final truth lingered in every heart left behind. Respect and dignity cost nothing, but they mean everything.